Hello and welcome to day 2 of the Girlfriend's Guide to Unpacking White Privilege, White Supremacy Culture. So today we're going to be talking about white supremacy culture and what it means and how it got to be dominant. And in that dominance, how do we define it? So we ended our last session talking about manifest destiny and this idea that God had said that white people should expand over all of North America. And that expansion has led us to a culture that is so powerful because it's so present, and yet at the same time, it's so hard and difficult to name. We talked about how culture is everywhere and white culture is everywhere. Maybe you go into a Chinatown or a Little Italy or a Black neighborhood and you get a taste of some other culture, but you bring your white culture with you. So what we're going to talk about today are the characteristics that define white culture and are damaging because they're used as norms and standards without being proactively named or chosen or selected as part of what we are agreeing to. It is something that exists without a definition. So the reason that it's damaging is because we end up promoting white culture and white supremacy culture without thinking, which means that we're not making space for people who are not part of the white dominant culture. And this happens in our lives, it happens in our schools, it happens in our communities, it happens in our counties and states, it happens in our government, it happens everywhere, including the workplace. And the workplace is one of the places that we see it happening the most because there are damaging characteristics that define how people are successful at their work. And so that is what this is about today. So I'm going to take you through some definitions of what these different culture elements are. You may feel like some of them relate to you and you're like, wow, I grew up with that and I didn't even realize it was part of my culture. It's just who I am. And some of them you might think about and go, I noticed that a while ago and that's something I decided I didn't want in my life anymore. Or this might be something that is completely alien to you or completely new to you. So we're going to go through it and we're going to talk through them. And if you have questions, you are welcome to put them in your homework that'll be assigned at the end of this. And you're also welcome to come into the group or put something in the Q&A thread so it makes sure that it gets covered in some of the Q&A sessions that we'll be doing. All right, so we're going to start. The first element that makes white culture supremacy dominant is perfectionism. Now, what is perfectionism? Psychologists say that perfectionism is a personality trait and it has roots in early childhood. But the thing is that there's another way of talking about perfectionism. It is a perfectionism of those ideas that are already held by our culture. In our white supremacy culture, there is little appreciation amongst how others are doing things, appreciation that is expressed directly to those who deserve it as opposed to those who get the most credit anyway, because they're already being perfect, perfect in how people show up, perfect in how people look, perfect in how people act. So what happens in perfectionism is that we never really muzzle any kind of interruption to racism. We never break the silence. And so how that shows up in everything is how we judge things, who we think is good and not good. We point out inadequacies in other people because it doesn't feel like it's connected to the norms. Now, I'm not saying anybody here is mean or judgy. It's just what we notice. We notice it because it's part of the soup that we're swimming in. We don't even consider that it might be another thing that is happening. We just notice that something is different. In fact, we often gossip about other people's inadequacies when it comes to perfection. Oh, she's fat. Those clothes don't look good. Wow, she's acting a certain way, or he's acting a certain way. This is all about trying to have a certain way, look, shape, feel that everybody aligns with so that we can feel perfect. So we often mistake and personalize these things that make us feel like someone might be reflecting badly on us in terms of our perfection. And what happens is often when we are faced with something where someone is challenging our perfection, we actually feel upset and we oppose what we're hearing as opposed to, what is actually going on. And the reverse is also true. Because when we're the ones who are imposing this perfection, what happens is if someone says to you, hey, that's not okay with me, we get offended as opposed to understanding that we made a mistake and there are some lessons learned. So how do we counteract perfectionism? I think the biggest thing that we need to do is we show up with appreciation. Whether it's at work or at home, we develop a culture of appreciation. We define expectations within that particular workplace or household or organization where everybody understands what's expected so that our different definitions of what is good and right don't come into the mix. And then we identify mistakes, whether we've made them or others have made them, as an opportunity for learning. It's super important to not personalize these mistakes, because we want to be able to really understand where we're at, recognize what we may or may not have done that may have offended someone. And we do it all the time, right? We don't necessarily notice it. And that's because we want to be good people so badly. We don't want to be someone who makes mistakes. So because they make us embarrassed, they make us feel like I'm not good enough. They make us feel like I don't belong. So imagine if you're a person who's not part of the white dominant culture, how you feel already. You're born not feeling good enough, embarrassed, and don't get involved, don't get enough. So when we're at work and when we're in life, it's so important, and this is a lesson you all learned before, that when you need to point something out to someone, that we point out something good before we make the observation or the criticism. Because we're often bringing our own lens to the situation and saying, this isn't right, you didn't do it right. But that is because people didn't necessarily have their expectations aligned with ours. So what's interesting about perfectionism is it really leads into some of the other things we're going to talk about now. Isolationism, individualism, separateness. What happens when this perfectionist culture, there's this one-way culture, feeds into everything else? So the second one on this list is called a sense of urgency. Some of you may have heard this story before, but I want to tell it again. I was at a conference once and I was sitting behind two women, and the speaker had come off the stage and we were waiting for the next speaker to come on, and I'm sitting behind these ladies and one is looking at her phone, and she says to the other lady, in that 1 hour speech, I got 14 messages, emails from work. And the other lady looks at her phone and she goes, 14? I got 30. And the first woman says, I didn't say 14, I said 40. There was this desire, this need, this urgency about who was busier, whose life was fuller, who was more important, who needed to get back to their work fast enough. Now, I call this sense of urgency something I call crazy busy. And I really am very strong about the fact that I don't use the word busy, and I certainly don't use the word busy with the word crazy attached to it. Because what happens when we do this is that we make ourselves important. And that is what this second concept, sense of urgency, is all about. It's this idea that it makes it difficult for anyone else to be included in the conversation because everything is moving so quickly. The idea that everything has to happen at a certain pace, which means there's not thoughtful decision making being made. There's not a long-term consequence that's being considered. This is what the quarterly result has done to our country and the world, is because we're looking at what this particular company did in this urgent quarter period of time. How are you supposed to ever do long-ranging research if you have to show up every quarter and tell the people who are wheeling and dealing with money and stocks and financing that you didn't do as well this quarter as you did last quarter? So there's this urgency that's built into our society. And what happens is we end up sacrificing potential allies because we want quick, visible results. Over and over again, we're driving towards the solution of getting it done, as opposed to getting it done well, or getting it done in a way that is bringing all different kinds of voices to the table. So what happens is you end up having all these kinds of victories for white people, because the white people are dominant and this sense of urgency is their natural way of going. So what happens is we need to create antidotes for this. We need to find ways in our lives that we're decreasing the crazy busy and we're increasing the time that it takes for us to do any one thing. Because it is in the rushing that we are actually moving against the goals of inclusion and diversity, and we're moving directly into the white dominant culture. So that is the second one. The third one we're going to talk about is individualism. And this is a huge one. Remember, if you're perfect and you're fast, who do you have time for? I've got to get it done, and I've got to get it done perfectly. So the individualism culture in the US is absolutely, bar none, truly how we live. I think about it in my own family. My father once said to me, and he said this in the most positive way, each one of my kids and even my wife, we are silos unto ourselves. We can do whatever we need to get done by ourselves. And if we come together to talk about it, that's awesome. But it's this individual culture that I was brought up in, and many of us have been brought up in, that makes us feel like we're participating in life in the right kind of way. That's a white thing. That's not how other cultures live. I mean, you've seen families where, there may be grandchildren and parents and grandparents and maybe even great parents living in the same home, collectively raising children. That it's not about the individual, it's about the group. I remember before I really had gotten into the world of inclusion and diversity, I would go out to a shopping mall or something and I'd see a group of Asians shopping, and there was like 20 people looking for one sweater for one of the participants. I didn't understand it because me getting someone to come shopping with me would never have happened. So this individualist thing is really interesting in our lives and in our relationships, because what happens at work is that we don't have an ability to really delegate or work with others. Because if it doesn't get done, our perfectionist part is like, oh shoot, it didn't get done. And if they're not doing it the way I think it needs to get done for it to be perfect, I'm just going to take it over again. I'm just going to take it back. I'm going to do it. I'm going to finish the work. I'm going to be the one who steps in, and everybody's supposed to be writing their part of the report, that they're not getting it done. So I'm just going to go write their part of the report, and I'm going to be the one. And so what happens is that this leads to isolation. It leads to more individualism, and it leads to a place where competition ends up being more highly valued than cooperation, because there's not a building of comfort around what it truly means to work in a team. And this happens not only in teams at work, it happens in collective societies, it happens in families, it happens between families. Now, some of this is starting to change, but when I talk about kind of what made this dominant white culture, this individualism was an enormous piece of this. So, for example, if you're dealing with individualism at work, how do you counteract that? What do you do? And the biggest thing that you want to think about is, how do you create shared goals where people understand how working together will improve overall performance? And how do you evaluate people's ability to work in a team as well as their ability to individually get their work done? So we have to make sure that all the people are getting credit for their participation. And I'm not talking a trophy for participation, that's not what I'm saying, but how they showed up and giving recognition in the way that they showed up. Because when we make people accountable to a group rather than as individuals, we start to create a culture where we can bring people together to solve problems in a different way. And it's been proven over and over again in study after study that when you have diverse voices at the table, you come up with the most innovative solutions. So this is a really big one that I'd love for you to think about and really understand, because imagine when you're in an individualist culture that is based on a sense of urgency and perfection, you end up with competition. Competition where people want to take credit for who wins, who got it done, who should get a promotion. We have leaders that are co-opting local efforts because they want the power and they want the credit that goes with their desire for individualism. So that was the third thing that we're going to talk about. The fourth one is defensiveness. So defensiveness is so interesting. It is cultural. And if you are a person who, when you're criticized, feels defensive, please know that you learned this behavior. It is embedded so deeply in our culture, it's probably baked into our DNA at this point. Because what happens is when people in power are criticized, they view it as threatening or inappropriate or rude. And what happens is it means that their eyes aren't open to any kind of change ever. It means that when they're in a new situation and something goes awry and someone points it out, their defensiveness makes it really difficult for anyone to move forward. And in many cases, a lot of people who are in a one down position to the person in power aren't going to even raise the issue. So what happens in our culture and in the world is that there's a lot of energy that we spend trying to make people who are in power positions, we tiptoe around to make sure their feelings aren't getting hurt because we don't want them to explode with their defensiveness. So ultimately, defensiveness of people in power creates oppression. And that oppression, imagine if there's an entire country of people who are perfect, have a sense of urgency, are individuals, and if they are criticized in any way, shape, or form, and it might not be even a criticism, it could be, hey, what do you think about this? That the person takes as a criticism because that is part of white dominant culture. And what do? It's everywhere. So how to counteract this? We have to start to understand that the system, the structure itself cannot facilitate a solution to this problem. What the real answer is understanding that defensiveness and fear are so tightly connected to each other, because it's that fear of losing power, losing face, losing comfort, losing their privilege that is making people defensive to begin with. So if you've been in a relationship with a partner or a child or a coworker or a friend, and there was a time where you felt yourself get so defensive, it's really important to ask yourself the question, well, what was I afraid of losing? What am I losing if I just listen? What am I losing if I open my ears in a different way and see things in a different way? Now, you're in this program, which means you're interested in doing this work and you're interested in opening, or maybe you've already on the path of opening. But when we start to see it in other people, we start to see how pervasive the culture is. And you can also start to see how oppressive it is because people do not want to offend the people in power. That is the fourth. The fifth component of what makes up a white dominant culture is the idea of quantity over quality. It's the idea that more is better, whether it's more money, more fancy cars, more homes, more clothes, more things, online, more people, more likes, more numbers, more attendees, more subscribers, more readers. Like things that are measurable are important to us. How many did you do? What level did you get to? What score did you get? As opposed to things that aren't measurable. The quality of relationships, the idea of collaboration in decision making, the ability to constructively deal with conflict, whether it's with yourself, your partner, your spouse, your child, a coworker. This idea that we have all of these quality kind of factors that are not measurable, they're qualitatively measured. And what happens is we attach less meaning. In the culture of white dominance, quantity is what we believe is important, which is why influencers online right now have so much power, because they can say something and the whole world moves. And this is happening in our government currently. The president says something, doesn't matter, there's not quality necessarily in what he's saying or truth. But what happens is that people move. This influence that happens because there's a quantity that's at play. You can be richer, you can have more, there'll be less immigrants. Things that are measurable as opposed to things that are not measurable. So we need to move away from a world where measurement is the value and move to a world where measurement is only part of the value, because it is not getting us to the end. And it certainly isn't helping us deal with the discomfort of emotions and feelings, which aren't measurable at all. So when we think about quantity over quality, and we start thinking about it in the larger scale of the country, I want you to think about, where does this play out for you? Where are you noticing numbers? I notice how many people view my videos. It's a thing I do online, and I have to ask myself, why does this matter to me? As long as the right 3 people come and take my program with me, doesn't matter if 200 or 400 or 800 or however many people saw it. But I live in a quantity culture, and I have to work really hard to recognize I have 3 quality people who are taking this program with me right now. And that is way more important than having 2,000 people viewing me and no one is willing to go there and engage. The next one is called There's Only One Right Way. I don't know about you guys, but I've certainly been exposed to this, and perhaps I've been accused of it before. I had a partner years ago who used to call me PAE, particular about everything. And I said to him at the time, I'm only particular about the things I care about. But when I care about them, there was one right way to do it. I was in the wrong, quite frankly. It wasn't the best way for me to be showing up in the world, but when I was younger and I was really deeply entrenched in the white dominant culture, this is what I believed. So one right way is the belief that there's a one way to do things. And once that everybody gets it and understands and is introduced to this right way, they'll go, oh, I see the light, and they'll adopt it. Because when we think that there's only right way, we feel like we need to evangelize our right way and tell everybody else so that they'll come and change and adapt, and look how successful you can be if you do it like me, this one right way. We saw this when the missionaries came through the US and even around the world, where you have Catholicism in places where you would never imagine Catholicism, because there was a belief that there was one right God, and that if you didn't follow this one right God, you were going to be in deep trouble and you weren't going to get the things that you wanted in life. And so, the antidote to this, the way we get through this, is to accept that there's so many ways to get to the same goal. And it's the goal that is important that we're talking about, not the way to get there. So that's a really important one. The next one is called paternalism. Paternalism. Such an interesting topic and so hard to see. When we live in a paternalistic culture, we can say the easy to see things like this is a country that was built by men for men, and it was white men specifically, it was heterosexual white men specifically, it was wealthy white men specifically, right? That's what paternalistic culture is on the surface level. But what it really means is that the way power and decision-making happen are clear to one group of people, those with power, and unclear to people without power. So what happens is the people with power think that they're capable of making decisions for and in the interest of those who without power. Those with power often think that it's not really necessary or important to understand the viewpoint or experience of those who they're making a decision for. And we see this all the time. I remember, gosh, this must have been almost 10 years ago at Mass General Hospital. I had had a surgery. I had had surgery 17 years ago. And about 10 years ago, I went to the hospital and I said, listen, I had such a horrible experience post-surgically. I'd like to start an organization where we get patients who are on committees so that doctors understand what the patient point of view is all about. And I ran this organization for about 6 years, and ultimately we got patients on many of the very important decision-making committees in the hospital. But can you imagine? It was a hospital. And they had designed every experience without the patient or the family member in mind. So, you know, the doctors, it's an academic center. They come in, they do their rounds, they talk to each other. They weren't really engaging with the patient, except for to say, how are you? Here's what your, measurable levels are. So what happens in a paternalistic society is that the people who have the power think that they know what's right for everyone. And those without power, in this particular system and structure, they don't really know how decisions get made and who gets to make them. But they're really familiar with the impact of those decisions because those decisions affected them. I'll tell you another quick story. I was working in the Bay Area at the beginning of the .com era, and a bunch of us had done quite well at that time. And we decided to put our money together and create something called Social Venture Partners, which was a venture fund for social issues. And part of our work is we decided to adopt a neighborhood in San Francisco. It was a neighborhood that had really been compressed because of all the building that was happening during the beginning of the .com era and all the companies that were starting. And it was this very small neighborhood in the middle of the city that had 5 languages that are spoken and 1 community center. And a community center was next to a jail. And it was an impoverished neighborhood. The parents, if there were 2, had 2 or 3 jobs each. There was 1 parent, it was a tough situation. And what happens is the kids would get out of school and they would go to the community center, and the guys would get out of jail and they would go to the community center too. So after school, when the parents weren't home and the kids went to the community center, you can imagine what it was like for people who just got out of jail. Not that they're all bad people, but many of them were shooting up drugs, and they're hanging in the same place where these kids are hanging. So, we came in as paternalistic people, and we're like, we're going to help solve this problem. We're so smart. And what happens, and I'm going to tell this story later in the program more deeply, is we got it all wrong. Everything that we started coming up with for this neighborhood and this community, we got wrong. And when I tell the rest of the story down the line, you're going to start to see how paternalism fit in. We thought what we would like to have as the answer, we thought that was the answer that they were going to want as well. So that's paternalism. The next one is called either or thinking. What this means is that things are either or, good or bad, right or wrong. You're either with us or against us. And this idea is that it's so closely linked to perfectionism. That's why I did that one first, because it's difficult to learn from mistakes or accommodate during conflict when everything is an either or. Oh, well, you're wrong and I'm right. Well, you're being bad, I'm being good. Well, if you're not with us, then you're against us, right? These are the things that people say. So the idea here in combating either or thinking is to introduce something called both and thinking, both/and thinking. And what happens when you create this is that you take complex things and you can imagine that two things can happen at the same time. So there are people who believe, for example, that poverty is simply a result of a lack of education. But if you dig deeper into the issue, it's not just about the lack of education. Poverty could be because of generations of poverty. Poverty could be because of the place that a family has lived for a long time. Poverty could be because of the kinds of schools that are in that community, but then you can get deeper, and we're going to talk about this later in the program. Poverty can be because of redlining or structural things that have happened in society that are specifically designed to keep certain groups down while raising other groups up. So what happens is when you start to slow things down, when you start to listen to other people, when you bring in some of the collaborative decision making, you start to realize that there are both and results. Yes, those can both be true, and there's another alternative. So I want you to think about situations where you have used either or thinking and where there actually is an opportunity for it to be both and. All right, so the next piece is called power hoarding. And the idea here, and you're going to have a million examples that pop into your head exactly when I say this, is that there's little, if any, value around sharing power. Power is seen as limited, and there's only so much to go around. So those who have the power feel threatened when anyone suggests changes in how things should be done, whether it's in government or organizations or your family. You're challenging my authority. You're challenging my power. You're seeing this a lot right now in the current election cycle, where with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, there are a lot of people who said, I would never allow there to be a Senate judicial hearing for the replacement if it happened. In Lindsey Graham's case, he said in the whole year before the election, he wouldn't allow it to come, and he's the head of the Judicial Committee. But what happens? Right before the election, I think it was 35 days out, and Lindsey Graham comes forward, he says, nope, we're gonna have it because I'm gonna make an excuse, Brett Kavanaugh changed my mind. But let's really look into it. When you're power hoarding and it's an election year, and there are threats to your power and you're being reelected, what you're going to do is you're going to align yourself with the highest power around you. And in this case, it's aligning with President Trump and what he wants to do, because the people love Trump. They've given him all of their power. And so we have people like Lindsey Graham flip-flopping and saying, nope, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to bring it forward and we're going to have a vote, and that's what's going to happen. When we hoard power, it's because we usually have fear that the power is going to be taken away from us. So the idea of power sharing is really challenging for people. Why? Well, first of all, you have to get rid of the idea of yourself as an individual if you're going to share power. It means that whoever has the power is going to look out for the other people. But this white dominance culture that we live in says the people in power are not going to look out for you at all. In fact, they're going to try to dominate you with their paternalism and make decisions for you on your behalf. So we have to really look at and understand how leadership happens, how productivity happens, how we get people in our lives, in our societies, in our workplaces to really consider what it means to take personal responsibility within your role, within the group goals, and sharing power. Now you can imagine if you were in a family or a company or a society and you decided that you were going to try to get rid of power hoarding, the next white dominant culture element would definitely come up. And it's called fear of open conflict. People who are in power are so scared of conflict that they try to ignore it and run away from it. And when someone raises an issue that causes them discomfort, the response is to blame the person for raising the issue rather than looking at the issue, which is actually causing the problem. Now, you've had this happen in your life. I'm sure you have. We all have, where you go to someone you're in relationship with and you say to them, when you did this, I feel like you don't like me. Well, the person you say that to is going to get mad. Why? First of all, they don't want open conflict. Second of all, you're telling them how they feel. And then they're going to get angry at you because you were angry at them. You did this and it made, even if you said it in the proactive, you did this and it made me feel this way, or I feel this way when you do that. Even the most crystal clear communication on these topics are very difficult for people who are conflict averse. So our society doesn't like when people raise their voices. We have this emphasis on being quiet and polite. You know, when we're in the movie theater, if you've ever gone to a movie theater in a Black neighborhood, they talk at the screen the whole time. And there's white people who are going to that theater and they're going, shh, because they want everybody to be quiet, because white dominant culture is that you're quiet in a movie theater. And Black culture is that you talk to the people on screen the whole time. Same thing with white church versus Black church. Go to Black church, people are amening and oh lording and hallelujahing the whole time. And in white dominant culture, which is Christian, people are quiet. People are polite. And when the conflict comes, they turn it around to the person who is raising the issue because they don't want to deal with it. So when we think that people raising difficult issues are impolite or rude or out of line, this is where this fear of open conflict becomes the norm. And look, we've all lived it, right? You're at a restaurant, something starts to get heated, someone raises their voice at you and you're like, shh, quiet, everybody's going to hear you. And that person is already so heated. And you know, when emotions are high, intelligence is so low. And so they're already heated and like, I don't give a crap who hears me. And this happens because when we're afraid of open conflict, it gets raised because the defensiveness and the fear get raised so that we don't actually have a model for dealing with conflict in a beautiful way, in a kind way, in a listening and open way. Our society really doesn't deal with conflict well. That is another piece of dominant culture. So just a couple more to take you through this whole thing. The next one is called objectivity. And the idea here is that there is this belief in our society that you can actually step far enough away from your own life to gain objectivity. A belief that emotions are inherently destructive, they're irrational, and they should not play a role in decision making. We see this all the time with people who are like, please don't get emotional about what we're talking about. We're trying to be rational here. I'm trying to use my logic here. And when we actually believe that there is something called objectivity, you can imagine that you're invalidating anyone who thinks in a different way. So if there is a belief that one way is the right way, this paternalistic, individualistic, perfectionistic way is the only way to view the world, you cannot see any of your privilege, any of your whiteness, any of your white culture. So what happens is we invalidate people who show emotions. We ask people to think logically and in a linear way. because we are the ones who can't keep up with their different way of thinking. This is a tough one, because if you see a path to a solution and you're like, can't we just go there? Other people might be like, well, I need to talk about this, and then I need to go to there, and I'm exploring over here, and then I'm going to do that other thing, and then I'm going to get to the goal. And for them, that is how you get somewhere. Now we have a conflict, which is the right way. If we believe in objectivity, that is a thing, there's only one right way, one right way, and that is the way of the very direct, very polite, we don't handle conflict, white way of doing it. The last piece of this puzzle I want to share with you is called the right to comfort. And this one, oh man, you're seeing it a lot right now. You're seeing it an enormous amount, that white people feel like any kind of unfairness against white people is the same, is equal to systemic racism that targets people of color. You might have heard this called reverse racism. So the idea is this: the belief that those who have power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort. I'm going to say that again. Those who have power, who, by the way, in all of the things above that we just talked about, have been denigrating emotion. They've been saying, no, don't be emotional, be logical. You know, use objectivity. Don't have conflict. I've got the power. There's only one way of thinking. Paternalism, perfectionism, individualism. All of these things were about tamping down emotions. But the right to comfort is the belief that people with power have the right to feel bad. They can start crying because someone made them feel bad that they had to hear the word white privilege. I remember there was a gentleman once, and we were talking about the concept of white privilege, and he got so upset with me, got so defensive. He's like, that is the most offensive statement you could ever make. And I said, what is? And he said, white privilege. And I said, well, who's that offensive to? He said, well, me. And I said, well, why? And he's like, I worked for everything I had. I, built a company. I hired people. I was very kind to everyone. I didn't have any privilege. I had to work for everything I got. So this person was so upset. They wanted me to comfort them just for using a word or concept, white privilege. The idea here is that white people who are so baked into the system, who have not opened their eyes, who have not even considered that there can be another world that they don't see right now, really believe that any acts that are helping people of color are directly against them personally or systemically, and that it is equal to what has happened to people of color. So you see this these days in the job market. People who used to be able to land a job really easily are now saying things like, well, now that there's all this affirmative action, I can't get a job. They're just going to hire any Black person who doesn't have my skills because they have to have a quota, right? They don't understand that in order to create an inclusive and diverse world, we actually have to create space for people to come in. I often use the example of a building with four corners. And when you have the corner office, you're the big dude. And if there's four white men in the rooms, or even three white men and a white woman who has fought her way to get up there, and this program is not about female versus male privilege, this is about color and white privilege. But in this example, if there's four people who are white who are in the corner offices, and we're like, yeah, we really want a Black executive. We think we found someone great. It was really hard. There's not very much talent in the pipeline that's diverse and actually qualified, which is an incredibly racist thing to say. And, you know, we found the person and we're going to hire them, but we can't. Well, how come you can't? Well, we can hire them at the director level, but we can't hire them at the VP level. Well, why can't you? Well, because we only have 4 corner offices. Well, then take one of the white people out of a corner office and put the black person in a corner office and give them a VP title. Well, I can't do that. They'll be very upset. That's not fair. That's reverse racism. And we also see it in what's happening in colleges these days, where there are groups of people who are now saying that they can't get into Harvard, for instance, my alma mater, because there's too many Asian people who are getting into Harvard. And now Asians feel like they don't have a fair shot. And white people feel like Asians have been taking up too many spots. And people of other colors are just left out of the equation altogether. Whew. These are the things. These are the big list of things that make our culture, our white culture, dominant. And one of the purposes of listing these characteristics of this white supremacy culture is a couplefold. The first one I want to say is this. There is a misnomer in our society that white supremacy culture, white supremacy itself, means the KKK. It means that it's people who are purposely, forwardly racist, and they actually do things and act in ways that are racist in nature. Now, just to be clear, there are lots of people in the world who have racist behaviors and don't even know it, but that's mostly because of the white dominant culture that they live in. It's their judgment of others. It's their, well, if I could do it, how come you can't do it of others? It's a lack of understanding of structural racism issues. So knowing that there's already a wrong name for what white supremacy culture means, right? People equate it to that really bad behavior. What they cannot see and what they're offended by seeing is how society and organizations unconsciously use these white dominant characteristics as their norms and standards. And it makes it impossible or extremely difficult to open the door to other kinds of cultures and standards. I love the movie Black Panther because it was so gloriously not about white culture in every way, shape, or form, about how the family was together, about the ancestors and going back and talking to them about the clothing and the colors and the warriorness. And there was no white culture in there. It was beautiful. In fact, the white guy was the bad guy. If you haven't seen Black Panther, you definitely should. There aren't that many places where we aren't completely embedded in white culture. And part of this program is going to be taking you through some of that so you can start to see it for yourself and that you can begin to act in ways that will hopefully be part of the solution. So as a result of all of these things, our societies, our cultures, our schools, they all say that they want to be multicultural. But they really only allow other people and cultures to come in if they adapt and conform to already existing cultures and norms. So when we can identify and name the cultural norms and standards, you can start to make a change. So I'll give you one more example before we go. And some of you have heard me tell this story before. You know, a long time ago, there became this idea that the United States was a melting pot. It was a melting pot because a lot of people from all over Europe were coming here. And if you came from the Czech Republic, where my family came from, Russia, or you came from, and any part of Europe, that you would melt in and become part of the melting pot that is the United States, this combination of all kinds of races and faces and cultures. What the truth is that if you're from the Czech Republic, AKA Swiss cheese, and you're from France, AKA Brie, and you're another person and you're from the UK, AKA Cheddar, when you put all of these cheeses into a melting pot, it melts into this yucky tasting American cheese. So how the system of white dominance in the US works is that unless you're willing to melt in and be part of the American cheese, you don't fit in. Your culture doesn't belong here, which is why we hear people saying all the time, well, they have to learn English. If you want to be here, you have to speak English, right? Well, did your ancestors speak English when they first came to this country? Come on. So the new analogy that we use to talk about the way that the country would be better off working is called a fruit salad. And with a fruit salad, you know, you can be a banana and I can be a piece of orange and someone else can be a slice of apple and someone else can be a strawberry or a grape or a blueberry. And when you eat that whole fruit salad out of a bowl, it's delicious together, but also you can still taste the banana. You can still taste the raspberry or the grape. The idea is that we can keep our cultures and our individualism and our races and our faces and be part of a society that accepts all. But in order to do that, we have to do a lot of unpacking of our white supremacy culture so that we can create space for other cultures to survive. So this was your tour de force travel through a lot of things about white dominant culture and what it means and how it may or may not be part of your worldview. I ask you to go to the group and look at the homework. That'll be in unit number for day 2 and answer the homework. I've also given you a couple of articles to read. So answer the homework first, then read the articles, okay? And then you have another piece of follow-up after that. I cannot wait to see what you come up with. If you have epiphanies or celebrations like we talked about in the last one, the last session on day 1, please come and celebrate them in the group. You can go live, you can make a post, you can tell us how you're feeling, you can share something that you read or a post that you saw. What I want to see is that you guys are really like looking at this and staying engaged and active in a positive way, because this work is heavy. And what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to hold the sadness and frustration at the same time that we're holding the joy that we're learning and the encouragement that there's work being done. So that's what I'd love for you to do in the group throughout this entire journey. And I can't wait to read what you do in your homework, and I will see you on Wednesday for day 3.